What should the president do about this North Korean threat?
Well, again, I think we need to encourage more defections from that regime, certainly offer safe haven for people who are willing to defect, and I think we need to put ourselves in a position to strengthen defenses of certainly South Korea, Japan, and we ought to seriously consider, from my standpoint, drawing a red line and saying anytime North Korea engages in another ballistic missile test, we're going to fire it, we're going to knock it down.
Let's begin with our senior White House correspondent, Jim Acosta. Jim, right now the future is uncertain, shall we say, for the president's national security advisor, or has that changed in the last few minutes?
It may be changing, Wolf. The White House is doing all it can to tamp down on the controversy swirling around National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. In just the last hour, White House counselor Kellyanne Conway said Flynn does have the full confidence of the president, and a White House official tells me Flynn has apologized to Vice President Mike Flynn, who had said the National Security Advisor had not talked about sanctions against Russia with the Russian ambassador. Now Flynn says that may have in fact happened. President Trump skated past reports that embattled National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is on thin ice. At a news conference with the Canadian Prime Minister, the president defended his agenda to keep the country safe.
I'm just doing what I said I would do.
But following revelations that Flynn had conversations about sanctions against Russia with the Russian ambassador well before Mr. Trump took office, a potential violation of federal law, a senior administration official said the knives are out at the White House, where there are fears Washington is hunting for Flynn's scalp. Flynn was at the president's side as top officials huddled over how to handle North Korea's weekend launch of a ballistic missile, a meeting held on an outdoors patio at the Trump Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, where guests were watching as aides used cell phone flashlights to illuminate potentially sensitive documents, raising security questions. But the White House was vague about Flynn's future when asked directly on the Sunday talk shows.
Does the president still have confidence in his national security advisor?
That's a question that I think you should ask the president.
General Flynn has said up to this point that he had not said anything like that to the Russian ambassador. I think now he's saying that he doesn't remember whether he did or not. So that's a conversation he's going to need to have with the president and the vice president to clear that up.
White House senior advisor Stephen Miller is also under scrutiny after his superheated criticism of the federal appellate court freezing the administration's travel ban on 7 majority Muslim countries.
There's no such thing as judicial supremacy.
Miller suggested the president's powers when it comes to national security should not be subjected to second guessing.
Our opponents, the media, and the whole world will soon see, as we begin to take further actions, that the powers of the president to protect our country are very substantial and will not be questioned.
That is a simply stunning statement. The idea that a senior advisor to the president would go on camera and say the president's authority will not be questioned shows both a striking lack of understanding of the structure of our government.
But the president loved the performance, tweeting congratulations, great job. Friends of the president are also beginning to point fingers at White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus.
I think there's a lot of weakness coming out of the Chief of Staff. I think Reince Priebus, good guy, well-intentioned, but he clearly doesn't know how the federal agencies work.
A criticism the publisher of the conservative news outlet Newsmax later walked back.
They are my criticisms. I don't speak for the president.
Now, one site here at the White House that will be sure to get people talking. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is scheduled to have lunch with the president here tomorrow. Christie was not offered a job in the administration despite being one of the top surrogates for the president out on the campaign trail. But with so many staff issues these days, Wolf, Christie may well be back in play. At least that's what everybody in Washington will be looking for tomorrow, Wolf.
Interesting stuff, Art. Thanks very much, Jim Acosta. Let's get some more now on the president's talks with Japan's Prime Minister about North Korea's most recent missile test. Our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto, is working this part of the story for us. So, Jim, it was, I guess, worrisome to a certain degree that the two leaders were having these sensitive conversations, reviewing documents while having dinner at Mar-a-Lago, the president's estate, the resort in Palm Beach.
Listen, at a minimum, it is curious and unnecessary. They set up at Mar-a-Lago secure rooms for the president to have secure communications and discussions. It would have been very easy for him and his team to go there, so it was unnecessary to be there. Then you get to the next level. Were those documents sensitive? We don't have a hard, direct answer from the White House. If they were, that would be, frankly, a gross violation. I mean, even behind closed doors, there are very strict rules. I had a security clearance. They used to have Marines walk around the office to make sure they weren't left on your desk, let alone reviewed in the midst of a crowd, lit up by phones, and those phones unsecure as well. They're basically traveling cameras with the possibility, which is very possible, that they could be hacked. So all of that very strange and requires hard answers from the White House as to what exactly happened there and why, in addition to having the discussions both on the phone and with a very close ally, Prime Minister Abe, there as they did that. We're seeing criticism, of course, coming from Democrats. The House minority leader, I should say, Nancy Pelosi, tweeting just a short time ago this criticism, saying that there's no excuse for letting an international crisis play out in front of a bunch of country club members like dinner theater. Fire Flynn, of course, directing her attention, the responsibility there, to the National Security Advisor, he's the National Security Advisor, could have very easily said to the president, listen, let's go behind closed doors to have this very sensitive discussion.
You would think that that's what they would do. And remember, these sensitive conversations that we're having eventually resulted in both leaders going before cameras 10:30 at night, Saturday night, and making brief statements.
Absolutely. And again, those statements, actually, Donald Trump did not mention North Korea. He did talk about his closeness and the importance of the alliance with Japan. But that's an important public statement that they were discussing that also would presumably be in a private setting as well. Meanwhile, it plays out like dinner theater, as Nancy Pelosi said.
Yeah. All right, Jim Sciutto, thanks very, very much for that. We're getting new details out of the Pentagon about this hour's breaking news. I want to go to Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr right now. Barbara, what are you finding out there about the National Security Advisor, retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn?
Well, Wolf, the president, according to Kellyanne Conway, may still have full confidence in Flynn, but people I am talking to say that does not mean that the ice under his feet is not growing thin. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in the front row of today's press conference with President Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister. An appearance of business as usual, even as questions swirl around whether Flynn will stay on the job. Revelations last week that U.S. intelligence intercepts show Flynn had discussed sanctions with Russia's ambassador on the very day President Obama imposed new ones. One U.S. official tells CNN there is a transcript of the discussion after the call was intercepted, but it does not show Flynn making any promises. A source close to the president says Trump himself is irritated by the latest reports about his national security advisor. But White House counselor Kellyanne Conway says the president has full confidence in Flynn. A former national security advisor to Vice President Joe Biden says Flynn's tenure will depend on how close he really is to Trump at this point.
Here, I think you're caught between two tendencies that the president tends to have. One is he really hates people who make him look bad. There's all the ridicule of the administration coming out of this. On the other hand, he doesn't like to look weak. He doesn't like to look like he was forced to do something because of outside criticism.
Flynn had originally denied he discussed sanctions with Russia to Vice President Mike Pence, who went on national television to vouch for the National Security Advisor.
I talked to General Flynn yesterday, and the conversations that took place at that time were not in any way related to new U.S. sanctions against Russia.
The two men were seen in an icy handshake after Flynn's turnabout became public. An aide close to Flynn says the NSC advisor can no longer rule out that he spoke to the Russian ambassador about lifting sanctions imposed by the Obama administration after the U.S. intelligence community determined the Russians interfered in the U.S. election. Flynn, the aide said, has no recollection of discussing sanctions, but added that the National Security Advisor couldn't be certain that the topic never came up. The Kremlin denied the two men talked about sanctions.
The reason that Flynn is in such trouble right now, and the reason why the Trump administration just doesn't label this as fake news, is they know that if there is a transcript, if there are recordings, that can't be dismissed.
After the Obama administration imposed sanctions, many experts were surprised Russia did not retaliate. A senior administration official tonight says Flynn has no plans to resign and no expectation that he's about to be fired. Wolf?
All right, Barbara, thank you. Barbara Starr at the Pentagon. Let's get some more on all of this. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin is joining us. He's the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Mr. Chairman, thanks for joining us.
Well, Wolf.
If Michael Flynn did in fact do this, in other words, have this conversation with the Russian ambassador to the United States, discussed sanctions, basically passed along word, don't worry so much about the sanctions, because once President Trump takes office, there's going to be a new era in U.S.-Russian relations, all this happening during the tail end of the Obama administration. Do you think he does need to step down?
Well, Wolf, that's an awful lot of ifs. You're aware, of course, his position is not a Senate confirmable position. I have not been privy to any of those conversations, and all I really know is what I've heard in the news reports. And so from my standpoint, this is really a matter within the administration. This is a decision for the president to make, not me.
We just got a statement literally this minute from the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer. Let me read it to you. The president is evaluating the situation. The statement says he's speaking to the vice president relative to the conversation the vice president had with General Flynn, and also speaking to various other people about what he considers the single most important subject there is, our national security. That doesn't sound like a complete vote of confidence, as we heard from Kellyanne Conway just a little while ago. Does it to you?
Well, again, I'm sure he's trying to find out what General Flynn told the vice president, what really General Flynn's recollections were. He wasn't privy to those conversations either, so he's probably gathering the facts. I've always thought that telling the truth is the best policy.
Because it's very strange, and I wonder if you'd get into this a little bit with me. Just within the past hour, the counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, says the president has full confidence in Michael Flynn. Then within an hour, the White House press secretary comes out once again with this statement saying the president is evaluating the situation. Those are two very different statements. What does that say to you?
Probably the same thing it says to you. I'm not privy to the conversations. It's really not my role to advise and consent on this particular position, so I'll leave that up to the president. He'll get to the bottom of it and he'll make his determination.
As the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee and a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I assume this is the subject of interest.
Well, what I'm primarily concerned is the actual substance of, for example, what North Korea is doing, the slaughter in Syria, Russia aggression in Ukraine. So I'm more concerned about that as opposed to the palace intrigues occurring right now in the Trump administration. So, yeah, I'm happy to discuss the real problem that, for example, North Korea poses in Asia and potentially in our homeland eventually.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to get to that. But the only point I'm making is that the National Security Advisor to the president advises the president on all of these most sensitive national security issues. So you want to make sure that that person is responsible, doing the right thing, not giving false information, for example, to the vice president of the United States, who then goes on television and repeats false information. But let's talk.
Well, let me tell you what I also want to do is I want to make sure that President Trump gets his cabinet confirmed. Right now, this is probably the slowest confirmation process in U.S. history in terms of the president being able to establish his governing cabinet, and that's something we really need to do. He needs to get his advisors in place, and Democrats, of course, are obstructing that process.
I think you raised some legitimate questions. Look, these issues that have been coming up waste a lot of critically important time, especially when there are critical national security issues on the agenda right now. Let's talk about North Korea for a moment. You heard our report, Jim Sciutto, reporting that when the president was briefed Saturday night on this ballistic missile firing by the North Koreans, he was having dinner with the visiting Japanese prime minister, and then they began reviewing sensitive documents, you see, with flashlights from portable and cell phones, and they were discussing all these issues. There were servers going by, guests going by. Is that a source of concern to you that they would be discussing North Korea, which arguably is the most important, the greatest national security risk facing the United States right now, in the middle of all of this?
Well, I'm not sure that anything came out of that. Let's face it, the President of the United States is the final authority in terms of what is classified and what needs to be revealed publicly. So, again, that'll be his determination. But, again, I'm highly concerned about North Korea. We held a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and this laid out the basic facts for a number of administrations. Literally for decades, nobody has been able to bring North Korea to heel. Nobody has been able to modify their march toward becoming a nuclear power and then gaining the missile capabilities of actually delivering a weapon potentially in the near future to our homeland. So that is something we need to be concerned about. The conclusion of our hearing, by the way, at least from my standpoint, was diplomacy has not worked, probably won't work. There are a number of high-level defections, or there are beginning to be high-level defections from Korea. We need to encourage those. We need to provide safe haven for those individuals. Hopefully that regime will eventually collapse, or we need to seriously consider taking kinetic action against some of these ballistic missile tests.
Well, don't you agree, though, Senator, that if, for example, you were at a dinner and your staff said there's sensitive information involving North Korea, we need to discuss this, it's best that you leave that table where there are a lot of guests, a lot of servers walking around. Let's go into a secure room and discuss this. Shouldn't the president have done that?
Again, I'm not going to second guess the president. I don't know exactly what the sensitive information was. I don't think anything's come out of that was overly sensitive. We know what North Korea did, and we ought to be discussing the substance and the danger of North Korea progressing down this path of having missile systems that could deliver a nuclear weapon to our homeland. That's what we really ought to be discussing. It's a real danger.
So what should the president do about this North Korean threat?
Well, again, I think we need to encourage more defections from that regime, certainly offer safe haven for people who are willing to defect, and I think we need to put ourselves in a position to strengthen defenses of certainly South Korea, Japan, and we ought to seriously consider, from my standpoint, drawing a red line and saying anytime North Korea engages in another ballistic missile test, we're going to fire it, we're going to knock it down.
Senator, we have more to discuss, including there are new developments involving the president's travel ban. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. We're following the breaking news out of the White House. An hour or so ago, Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the president, goes on television, speaks with reporters, and says President Trump has, quote, full confidence in the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. Now, within the last few minutes, Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, puts out a separate statement, very, very different, saying this, quote, the president is evaluating the situation. He's speaking to the vice president relative to the conversation the vice president had with General Flynn, and also speaking to various other people about what he considers the single most important subject there is, our national security. So all of a sudden, two top officials at the White House go from full confidence to evaluating the situation. We're going to find out what happened in the past hour. We're going to do some serious reporting on this and update you. In the meantime, we're back with Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. He's the chairman of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Mr. Chairman, we want to talk a little bit about the president's travel ban, now frozen by that federal appeals court. But first, I want to bring in our Justice correspondent, Pamela Brown. She's got some new developments to share with our viewers. What are you learning, Pamela?
That's right. Well, today the federal government filed a brief with Judge Robart, the judge in Washington state, asking for a delay in the proceedings because it wants to let things play out in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals with the possibility of a larger panel looking at the case. The government did not provide any new information on what it plans to do next, but this is yet another signal that the administration will not seek an immediate stay with the Supreme Court, as we reported last Friday. And sources are telling myself and my colleague Ariane DeVogue that top lawyers at the Department of Justice and the administration, Wolf, are huddling right now to figure out the next step forward after that stinging loss last week that keeps the travel ban on hold. Right now, officials are crafting language for a potential new executive order that would make clear legal permanent residents and visa holders have due process rights. There is even the possibility of more than one order being issued so that if one is challenged, the others could remain in effect. At this point, we're told the administration wants to continue to fight the lower court opinion, but add new language that could clarify their position. As one source told me today, there is a lot of lawyering going on right now to figure out how to make all of this work. Wolf?
I assume there is. All right, thanks very much. Let's bring back Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Senator, the president told reporters he will, quote, win the battle, talking about the travel ban executive order, then said they were looking at all sorts of options, including a brand new order. But if there is such an imminent threat right now that, in his words, bad dudes are rushing into the United States, should he just rewrite it and get on with it?
Well, first of all, I think the travel ban was a reasonable precaution. And, you know, the president has vast powers when it comes to refugees. For example, President Obama decided to let in 10,000 Syrian refugees just by consulting with Congress. He made the decision, consulted with Congress. Nobody challenged him. You know, we might have said whether we thought that was wise or not, but we thought he certainly had the legal authority to do so. And of course, presidents are certainly charged with the authority to keep this nation safe. So I think we have to, you know, run this process out. We have to establish, it's very important that President Trump has, and any president has, this power and authority. And so I'm a little concerned about what's happening right now through the legal system, but that's why I would certainly support a better crafted executive order, probably better implemented, because we have to establish really the president has to have this authority.
But let me follow up, because as you know, the president, he cites what he calls tremendous threats to the country right now. He said, and I'm quoting him, "We need speed for reasons of security." You're the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Is he citing new specific threats?
I know of no specific threat, but let's face it, Wolf, the threat of Islamic terror is real, it's growing, it's metastasizing, it's evolving. The fact of the matter is the Center of Immigration Studies did show that there are more than 70 people involved in and certainly charged with, some of them convicted of basically fomenting terrorist activity here in the United States from those 7 countries. So yes, this is a danger. We certainly need to continue reviewing our vetting process in terms of refugees, visa waiver program. But from my standpoint, if I'm concerned about ISIS operatives coming into America, I'm still concerned primarily about them coming through our very porous southern border, which also needs to be secured.
What about the northern border with Canada? There's a 3,000-mile frontier between the U.S. and Canada.
Well, it's certainly one of the reasons we held a hearing on Prime Minister Trudeau's acceptance under very rushed circumstances of more refugees from Syria for exactly that same reason. But our primary concern is our very porous southern border.
President Trump described these latest ICE raids, in his word, he called it a crackdown, saying today, he said today at the news conference, he said, "We will get the bad ones, but Democrats are concerned." As you know, California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein put out this statement: "These reports show the serious consequences of the president's executive order, which allows all undocumented immigrants to be categorized as criminals and requires increased enforcement in communities rather than prioritizing dangerous criminals." Is that the case? Are all undocumented immigrants right now being categorized as criminals and could be picked up and deported?
No, I believe the Trump administration, under the leadership of Secretary Kelly now, is, again, still prioritizing gang members, drug dealers, human traffickers, criminals. They are still prioritizing that, but they're just stepping up enforcement activity. I don't think the Obama administration did adequately enforce our immigration laws. This administration will.
Senator Johnson, thanks very much for joining us.
Have a great day.
Coming up, members of President Trump's team make new claims of voter fraud, but do they have any proof? We're checking the facts.